In different stages of the gaming journey that people go through, they'll usually reach a point of burnout. It's not exactly a feeling of giving up per se, but an intense desire to just simply move on, or to do anything but that. The very thing that you're getting tired of, that is. We can be so passionate about something and yet get so sick of it. Recently, I went through a Souls marathon, going from Demon Souls all the way to Dark Souls 3. And before all of that, I played through Lies of P, Mortal Shell, and Lords of the Fallen, the new one. The combined amount of playtime felt like an eternity, weeks upon weeks of grinding levels, beating bosses, and dying repeatedly. As I get older, it somewhat becomes more taxing to play games that demand more of your time. More specifically, story-based experiences. With multiplayer though, I still get burnt from it sometimes, but I never have that worry of forgetting important story elements because of the multiplayer's emphasis on replayability as well as dynamic experiences with other players. Sandbox-based games are also something I can get into and come back to eventually in the same manner, but for different reasons. But I wouldn't really be able to do that with single-player games, story-focused ones that I'm trying for the first time. If I get hooked on it, then I know that I'll commit to it. But if I have to make a conscious effort to do so, then it's just not meant to be. After I'd finished Dark Souls 3, I looked at the endless number of games in my library, knowing that there's no end to the list, and I'm sure that everyone can relate to this. I didn't want to play a single one, I realized. I felt that in that moment I was just done. For me, that is a moment when you realize that you are in fact burnt out, and you need to take a break from what you were doing before. Some people go the extra mile and quit it all completely, even deleting their accounts to make absolutely sure. Others realize that they just needed another genre or another form of media. I was in the latter, realizing that I needed the opposite kind of experience that I was going through before, something that was simpler and fun to play while still hiding a well of depth behind the curtains. Sometimes you just need a game like Vampire Survivors. Vampire Survivors has nestled itself in the halls of the indie giants due to its sheer impact in 2022, as well as its ever-growing influence on the future of roguelikes and bullet hell games. As we speak, there are over 600 games related to the likes of Vampire Survivors, including new demos and projects getting showcased each month. Roguelikes in general are incredibly popular, highly polished and replayable. People can't get enough of them. So much so that they have developed the mentality of crackheads on the street. Over 10,000 of them right now are playing through Balatro, and some are waiting for Slay the Spire 3, even though a second one is coming sooner than that. I've played a few of them myself, with my favourites thus far being Risk of Rain 1 and 2, Deadlink, and The Binding of Isaac. My favourites are growing each day, and Vampire Survivors, with each playthrough, is continuously proving its worth in my book. It's a game that's on the one hand familiar and yet different somehow. Fans of the shmup genre and the horde-based modes in other games, as well as horde-based games, will get the gist of what this game is offering on the table. But it comes with its own unique spins, and the circumstantial success that it got in 2022 helped pave the way for an entirely new genre of its own. A fleet of survivor-likes flooding the Steam markets, with some other heavy hitters carving their own territory, such as Halls of Torment, Death Must Die, Brotato, and 20 Minutes Till Dawn. But all of them trace back to Vampire Survivors, at least in terms of its impact and success anyways. As for the game itself, it was the perfect storm that I needed to quickly erode that burnout that I felt after the Souls-like marathon that I went through. When I decided to click on the game, it felt as natural as going to bed when you're tired, and before I knew it, I was hooked, line and sinker. It made sense why people obsessed over this game during the hype. I usually avoid games during their hype unless it's something that I'm also genuinely excited for, but even then, I hold my tongue for a while until the hype itself dissipates, so that I can talk about the game with more clarity and look at the game for what it actually is. And what is Vampire Survivors now? It is a game that is still as addicting as it was when it first released. People that do still play it or are grinding for the 30-minute mark or for builds, for the insane builds, mind you, that will let them AFK their session and getting all the achievements, those are the people that are still playing this game. But like the sun, it rises for a while and everyone basks in its glory. But as the day passes, the sun begins to set, and the only ones left are the ones who stayed to create a community. Everyone else that was on the bandwagon bought the hype, they loved the game, the streamers couldn't get enough, but when something else gets their attention, they do what they've always done. Look at something else and simply move on from what they were playing before. The same thing happened with Only Up, Lost Ark, New World, and is gradually happening with Power World and Helldivers 2. This is normal and is a natural cycle in gaming anyways. But Vampire Survivors was one of the few games that never really asked for much. It had a unique approach to supplying dopamine to the player in a specific span of time. It was very simple to play, and best of all, it was easy to run and was cheap, and no microtransactions either. It's another gem in the indie space, a space that is unbelievably large, that a masterpiece is always around the corner, whereas with AAA games, it's a roll of the dice. Just look at Dragon's Dogma 2 for instance. Vampire Survivors is not unlike the horde-based games that have come out in the past, where numerous forces in all directions are coming at you, and it gets progressively harder as time progresses. But a lot of them are more on the side of being endurance rounds, and there are some important distinctions between them and Vampire Survivors. For starters, the game is for the most part automatic. The main control you'll be concerned with is your movement. Weapons that you pick up and items that you pick up will act independently and will carry out their assigned functions without your input. This allows you to focus more on positioning and timing depending on what weapon you're using in order to control the mobs. Other horde games require a lot more from you in terms of combat and movement. You can't just sit idly by and shoot while playing Killing Floor, or in a game like Devil Daggers. Vampire Survivors, even with the amount of enemies, is designed with a simpler framework that allows you to play with one hand or even without touching the controls at all once your character is powerful enough. Which comes down to the other point, the item build variety. There are lots of items and weapons in Vampire Survivors that allows for a ton of variety in each session, which combines with the pool of characters along with their own stats and starting weapon. In the beginning you're not very powerful and the game eases you in, and like other horde games it gets progressively harder. But you also get more powerful as you obtain more items, as well as evolving said items. The scale of power is pretty insane in this game, and some builds allow you to delete everything and obtain an easy 30-minute session. Oh yeah, that's another thing, the use of time limits. Basically, the goal in Vampire Survivors is to reach 30 minutes to complete a stage. Lots of horde games or endless-based games are enjoyable after a while, but can lead to burnout once you've figured everything out. In a game like Killbug or Devil Daggers, they're great games and are fun for a while, but the lack of variety and choice of items and weapons made them less replayable, where the only incentive to go any further is to grind the leaderboard and get to the top. I don't have this issue at all with Vampire Survivors because the pool of items and characters, as well as the variety of stages with their own enemies, encourages different playthroughs with different builds. Vampire Survivors also does a great job of increasing the progression and scaling of both the enemies and the player's overall power. 30 minutes is a sweet spot for this type of game where you get the entirety of the experience each time, even when you don't always make it to the end. It ends just when it feels like it's just starting to get monotonous, which is a common thing in horde-based games or endless games where it goes on forever until you either die or get bored and quit the game. Other survivor-like games do a similar thing, creating a curated horde mode experience that's relatively short and sweet, keeping the attention span intact. It's like crack, but it's cheap and legal, and doesn't affect your health too much. On the surface, it displays a pretty simple art style where everything is pretty distinguishable. The areas themselves aren't really doing too much, and they don't interfere with the combat and behave more as a backdrop, allowing you to concentrate more on the enemies, the pickups, and the objects that you can destroy. Enemies come in all directions endlessly, but will change at certain intervals throughout the game's timer. It reminds me of Risk of Rain's scaling system that's intertwined with the game's timer, where the longer you're alive, the more intense the experience becomes. The game's magic, though, comes to life when you're shown a myriad of particles and attack animations flying once your build is complete. That and the numbers that frequently appear is part of the developer's intention to target the player's desire for a dopamine rush. And to add the final piece of the puzzle, there's also the use of the treasure boxes. Sometimes you'll get one item, 3 or 5 items. The anticipation to what you may get is an exciting prospect. The nature of its design is rooted in the developer's experience in the gambling industry. The display of items on the screen and the significance of combinations creates an addicting expectation for a reward, of hitting the jackpot basically. The developer takes this approach, but designs it in a non-monetary approach in the game, getting you hooked but without the consequences of long-term gambling sessions. Sometimes you'll get an upgrade for an item that you already have, or you'll get an evolved version of a weapon that you've maxed out and have paired with another item. But other times you'll get 5 items, and once you get it, you'll be approaching those chests with that expectation every time. It's part of what made the game so addicting, and it's never really quite clear until you actually experience it firsthand. It does have a story of its own, surprisingly enough. But like the shooters of old, it's just there to provide context to what you're doing and why. According to the wiki page, it's set in Italy, and someone who is definitely not Dracula is summoning monsters to cause carnage. The Belfasi family and other survivors go out to hunt Draculo, and that's pretty much it. Each of the main levels has you surviving for 30 minutes, only to usually get killed by Death, who kills you in the blink of an eye, or if you cheese him somehow, kill him and unlock a new character. Some of the bonus levels have their own conditions, but ultimately ends at a certain point anyways. Either way, if you reach the 30-minute mark and die, it still counts as a completed stage. Like roguelikes, when you die you start anew, in a playthrough that will come with some random variations. But not once in this game did I feel like I wanted to just quit after some annoying deaths. I've had some deaths where I died 10 seconds away from reaching 30 minutes, and even then, I still always came back for more eventually. This is a good sign of a roguelike game done right, and it's one of the few genres where I don't get too annoyed after dying, and look forward to the next playthrough, knowing that it may get easier, and if it doesn't, I'll at least have some experience to show for it. The game gives you so much to unpack and unlock, that for a good while, the focus becomes more about getting more items and characters for more successful runs, as well as investing in power-ups to give yourself a head start. The DLCs also have their own content, with even a narrative of sorts to follow, where each level follows after the other based on the events that transpired. As for the main game itself, you're just going through the levels, trying to last up to the end of the minute mark that ends the level. The large selection of characters each have their own stats and starting weapons, as well as an assigned buff that comes into play throughout the level. But once you've identified the best builds for each of the characters, then it just becomes a matter of whose design you like more. As for the enemies, there's a lot of variety that's separated across different levels, but they all have a similar function. Most will just get close to you and drain your health, while others will shoot projectiles. On its own, it's a game that would quickly get boring due to the limited controls that you have in the basic gameplay, to the point where the game is playing itself for you. But the combination of the item builds, the characters, the amazing music that gives me Castlevania vibes, and the application of visual eye candy makes this one of the most fun and addicting indie titles that I've played in a while. Again, the game has certainly made its impact, and it's had its time in the sun. The discovery of the game by popular streamers and the decision to launch it on Steam instead of staying on itch.io led to an unexpected level of success that a lot of indie developers hope for. But that level of success, the existence of the game itself, is thanks to a game that is part of the most contested part of the gaming world. Magic Survival. It was a game that the developer had taken inspiration from, the simple to play approach, but packed with a ton of depth in build variety and an emphasis on limited playtime. However, this game was on mobile, and it's a market that a lot of gamers shy away from, and for good reasons. The backlash towards mobile gaming in general is not completely unwarranted, because it often shows the most aggressive practices of enticing players to spend money in order to truly enjoy the game. But Magic Survival was one of the few mobile titles that felt like a genuinely well-made game to be played on the phone, and it is. Comparing this and Vampire Survivors, the resemblance of gameplay is quite telling. In effect, Magic Survival was the first game of this kind, the survivor-like game that is. And like Vampire Survivors, Magic Survival's gameplay can be rooted back to earlier games like Crimson Land, Ubermosh, or Robotron, other games that had variety in weapons, enemies, and a large field to play on, and time limits, like in Ubermosh, where the play session is 90 seconds, at least in the first one. Magic Survival is a game that deserves its flowers. To talk about Vampire Survivors, I felt that it was important to acknowledge this game because it offers a lot of content for a mobile game that's free. It has lots of classes with different starting points and different builds that encourage multiple sessions, not to mention the combination of magic spells. but it had the unenviable position of being placed in the mobile space, while Vampire Survivors made its nest in the PC market, which is why it ended up getting the accolades, the awards, the invention of the Survivors-like genre that's been brewing over the last 2 years. But those circumstances stemmed from the impact that Magic Survival had on the developer that led to the creation of Vampire Survivors. I highly recommend trying out Magic Survival, especially if you're already a fan of the Survivor-like genre. All you have to do is ignore the fact that it's a mobile game and just see it for what it is. Vampire Survivors is still going strong and even has some DLC coming out for it later on this year, and I'm looking forward to trying it out eventually. Since its early days on itch.io, its vision has remained consistent and has only expanded into the powerhouse it has become today. In time, the genre that people have associated it with, the relatively new term Survivor-like, will become more defined in the years to come. There is still plenty of interest. Developers are still taking notes from what Vampire Survivors accomplished, and how one can turn half an hour into an entire rush of dopamine, a curated effect of addiction without the withdrawals of heroin or the negatives in your bank account after a bad slap at the pokies. It's just a game that gives you exactly what you paid for. You get potentially hundreds of hours of playtime just for the price of a drink and a snack for the movies. The game can be addictive. The fix for another run is always there. It can be both a good and a bad thing, but either way, the game has a limit in its playtime that works, where you don't feel like you've missed out on other core mechanics. You'll get the gist of everything in one session, and the rest is just replaying it and seeing how far it takes you, seeing what other characters are like, as well as what effect other builds will yield. There's also the option for co-op play if you want someone to share the madness with you, but I feel like the game is at its peak when it's just you tackling the hordes on your own, basking in all the glory of multiplying numbers and making sprites disappear. Its simplicity is overshadowed by the smart application of player retention and careful progression of both the character and the levels. The music is fantastic, harkening back to some of the earlier Castlevania games that I used to play. In fact, there were times where I'd play soundtracks from Order of Ecclesia or Symphony of the Night and it would hit the nail in the coffin. Anyway, the game is still awesome, and I'm glad that I finally gave it a crack after all this time. I'll be sticking with it for a good while, playing it here and there. After all, there's more coffins to find that vampire, more stuff to unlock, more opportunities to unlock red depth, and more surviving to do. Stay tuned, and thank you for watching.